There are moments in life when you look back and realize, that was the moment when everything changed forever. It's when you are no longer a carefree child, yet not entirely an adult either. It was when I was 17, and my family suddenly turned into a mess I had no idea how to handle. A simple decision made by my mom and dad turned my life into an endless story without resolution. That was when I realized I had lost something more important than anything else in the world: the warmth and peace of a family. And when I look back, I can't help but wonder if there was anything I could have done to stop it. That day, when my mom and dad told me to sit down in our small living room, I had no idea my life was about to enter a completely different chapter. My dad looked at me, his eyes filled with determination but also a hint of exhaustion, and then he spoke. "Evelyn, we're getting a divorce." There was no yelling, no tears. Just silence. A silence I had learned to feel over the years. My mom sat still, her eyes fixed on her hands as if she didn't have the strength to look at me. At that moment, I didn't cry, nor did I feel angry. Maybe I had known for a long time that this was how it would end. We had been living like two separate families under one roof, each in our own world, just waiting for the day everything would officially fall apart. After my dad moved out and rented a small apartment in the suburbs, I still visited him regularly on weekends. His apartment wasn't big, but it always had a peace I couldn't find at my mom's house. Every time I was with my dad, I felt like I could breathe, without having to listen to the hushed arguments between my mom and the new person in her life. My dad was always the one who listened to me, the only person who didn't make me feel like a burden. We didn't talk much about my mom, but whenever he had the chance, he encouraged me to do what I loved. Everything felt lighter when I was with him. As for my mom, after the divorce, she met someone new. Robert. That was his name. Was an older man with a polished appearance and a lifestyle that I found a bit too refined. My mom started to change after she met him. Long phone calls I couldn't hear. Evenings spent with Robert made me feel like I was no longer a part of her life. And then, after a few months, I learned they were getting married. Robert moved in with my mom, along with his daughter Sarah, a girl around 13 years old. At the time, I didn't fully understand what was happening, but I could feel that this family was no longer where I belonged. Sarah, with her bright eyes and radiant smile, always acted sweet and polite in front of my mom. But when no one else was around, she became a completely different person. She did things I couldn't explain, like making my belongings disappear or making me feel worthless whenever my mom wasn't there. And Robert? He never treated me like a stepdaughter. Instead, he would make subtle comments, gentle yet cutting, like, "Evelyn, maybe you should reconsider the way you dress." Or, "If you spent less time on your phone, your grades would probably improve." Every time I heard those words, I just wanted to leave immediately. But things only truly became unbearable when Sarah, Robert's daughter, destroyed an important research project that I had spent an entire week completing. I can never forget that day when I returned home after a long day at school. That morning I had felt so confident about my research project. It was more important to me than anything else. It was my final opportunity to prove myself before graduation. I had spent so much time and effort conducting interviews, gathering data, and compiling everything in the most detailed way possible. The night before, I had stayed up late finishing the remaining sections. Everything was ready to be submitted the next day, and I felt incredibly proud of myself. But when I stepped into my room, all I saw was chaos. My project, everything I had worked on for the past week, was now a pile of torn, ink-stained papers. A chill ran down my spine as I saw Sarah standing there, her hands covered in ink, her wide eyes pretending to be innocent. "What is going on here?" I yelled, my hands shaking as I pointed at the ruined papers. Sarah said nothing, just took a few steps back. But the ink on her hands had already exposed the truth. "What the hell, Sarah?" I shouted, grabbing her and dragging her downstairs, where my mom and Robert were watching TV. As I entered the room, my mom's face showed no emotion. She just looked at me blankly, as if I were the one causing trouble. "Look at this," I shouted, pointing at Sarah's ink-stained hands. She ruined my project, all of my hard work. Robert jumped from his seat, his face turning red. Get your hands off my daughter, he bellowed, pulling me away from Sarah without even looking at the destruction she had caused. What the hell are you doing? He shouted. You're harassing my daughter? My whole body trembled with anger. I looked at my mom, waiting for her to say something, to defend me, to react. But she just sat there, silent. She simply shook her head, disappointment in her eyes. Evelyn, what are you doing? Don't overreact, you're only making things worse. I stood there, unable to understand why my mom remained silent. This was a week's worth of my work. Not just any project, but the most important one in my academic career. How could she do nothing while watching her own daughter be treated this way? Robert, a man who was practically a stranger, had just called me a fool right in front of her, and I received no words of comfort. I couldn't breathe anymore. I couldn't endure the silence any longer, and suddenly, I understood. I could no longer live in this house. My mom's silence, her blind protection of Robert and Sarah, everything made me feel like an outsider. I was no longer my mother's daughter, at least not in her eyes. That very night, I started packing my things. I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had just happened. Quietly, I stuffed clothes and books into a bag. I didn't say a word to my mom, simply because I couldn't. I didn't know what to say when all I ever received in return was silence, a refusal to protect me. I called my dad without a moment of hesitation. Dad, I want to live with you. My voice was hoarse, as if I no longer had the strength to contain the emotions surging inside me. I need a place to escape from all of this. My dad immediately sensed that something was wrong. What's going on, Evelyn? Are you okay? I can't stay here anymore. Mom won't protect me, and Robert. I couldn't finish my sentence. Words weren't enough to describe what I was feeling at that moment. My dad didn't ask any more questions, he only said one thing. All right, I'll come get you. Within 20 minutes, I had left everything behind and stepped out of that house. My footsteps felt lighter than ever. As I got into my dad's car, I felt as if I had just been freed from a prison. I didn't speak to my mom for a long time after moving in with my dad. Even when she called me in the evenings or sent messages to check on me, I simply didn't want to answer. Every time my phone rang and I saw her name on the screen, I just remained silent and ignored it. I couldn't bear her indifference, her silence about everything that had happened. The feeling of being abandoned is not something a child can easily forgive. My mom never stood by my side when I needed her the most. Instead, she always chose Robert. Always defended Sarah. Even when I repeatedly asked for her help. Every time, she would give vague explanations, saying things like, Robert only wants what's best for you. Or, Sarah is just a child, you have to understand her. To my mom, I was still just an arrogant daughter who refused to be patient. Not once did she stand up for me. Not once did she speak out when I was mistreated or insulted. And when I moved out, she just stood there, looking at me, saying nothing except, Don't do this, Evelyn, you'll regret it. My mom's silence clung to me like a shadow. Even though I had made the decision to leave, I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. I still remembered the evenings when I lived at my mom's house. The quiet dinners we used to have before Robert and Sarah entered our lives. Back then, my mom would ask me about my day, about the things I liked, and I would happily tell her everything. But now, those days had completely vanished, leaving only lonely nights, no mother, no warmth, just bitter memories. My dad was the only source of comfort I had. After I moved in with him, everything felt so much lighter. He wasn't just the father I needed, he became my friend, my companion through difficult times. He checked on me every day, asked about school, about what I was doing, about my plans for the future. Every time he looked at me with care and warmth, I felt loved. Like I wasn't abandoned. As for my mom, she simply continued living her life as if nothing had happened. I knew she still tried to maintain a relationship with me, but I couldn't easily forgive her silence. When she called, I would only give brief responses before avoiding the conversation. Every time I spoke to her, I felt even more distant. I could never forget the moment she stood there, watching me and Sarah, yet saying nothing, just quietly accepting everything that happened. Then one day, I received a message from my mom. She said she wanted to meet, that she wanted us to talk like we used to. Evelyn, I'm sorry for everything that happened. Can you forgive me? The message made me freeze, my heart weighed down by conflicting emotions. I asked myself, could I forgive her? Could we go back to the way things used to be, when she was always on my side? But no. I knew that what had happened couldn't be erased so easily. She didn't protect me when I needed her most. And now, she wanted me to forget everything with just a few words of apology? I didn't reply. I didn't know what to say, didn't know if I could open my heart to her again. Part of me wanted to cut ties completely, to never have to relive the pain of thinking about her. But another part of me still remembered the mother I once loved, the one who used to hold me and tell me everything would be okay. In the end, I decided not to meet her. I couldn't, and didn't want to, return to someone who had chosen to side with those who hurt me. My mom would always be my mom, but the bond between us had changed too much. Like any other relationship in life, some things simply cannot be repaired with words. It was too late. After moving in with my dad, I finally felt the freedom I had never had before. Life with him wasn't always easy, but it was the escape I needed. I no longer had to live in my mother and Robert's shadow, no longer had to endure her silence and indifference. I started learning to be independent, to stop relying on anyone, and I knew exactly what I had to do to build a secure future. I focused on my studies, especially as graduation approached. After everything that had happened, I refused to let personal struggles affect my future. Every day, I pushed myself to work harder, never allowing myself to waste time. I was no longer a child waiting to be protected. I was a young woman standing on her own 2 feet. I dedicated myself to my education, completing all my assignments and exams, never missing a single opportunity to prove my abilities. My dad was always by my side, encouraging me every step of the way. He understood that I needed support to get through the challenges of school, and he was always ready to help whenever I felt overwhelmed. He never forced me to be the perfect daughter. He simply respected my choices and decisions. With his support, I felt more confident than ever, and that gave me the strength to succeed. When I graduated, I received a job offer from a major consulting firm. It was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. The job wasn't easy, but I was always ready to face challenges. With each passing day, I grew stronger. Gradually, I gained experience, and my first paycheck was enough to make me feel like I could finally support myself without relying on anyone. I started saving for the future, creating a clear financial plan. I wanted to buy my own home. Not because anyone told me to, but because it was something I truly wanted. It would be the independence I had always longed for. Even though I was building a life of my own, my mom never stopped trying to contact me. She called, she texted, but I kept my distance. There were moments when I felt guilty for not responding to her messages, but then I reminded myself that I was doing the right thing. My mom continued living with Robert and Sarah, and it seemed like she never really understood why I left. I knew she was trying to mend our relationship, but the things she had done in the past couldn't be easily forgotten. The pain I had endured was too deep, and I couldn't simply forgive everything just because of a few apologies. I continued focusing on my career. My job at the consulting firm opened new doors for me, and I was always ready to take on bigger challenges. A year after starting, I was promoted to team leader, and the quarterly bonuses helped me save even more for my future. Every evening, when I returned to my small apartment, I felt a sense of happiness for everything I had accomplished. Even without my mother by my side, I felt like I was finally living the life that was meant for me. And so my life gradually found stability. I had good friends, a job I loved, and most importantly, the independence I had always craved. Though I sometimes thought about my mom, about the days when she used to care for me, I knew I was on the right path. No Robert, no Sarah, Just me and the goals I had set for myself. On weekends, as I sat in a small cafe with a book and a cup of hot coffee, I felt the peace I had been searching for. Everything in my life was built by my own hands, and that was an indescribable feeling. After years of hard work and saving, I was finally able to buy a small home in the suburbs. This was my dream. A place I could call my own, where I could live freely without worrying about anyone invading my space. It wasn't a luxurious mansion, but it was the result of years of effort, saving every penny. It was a symbol of my independence and everything I had achieved. On the day I moved in, I felt like I was stepping into a new chapter of my life. The house had 3 bedrooms, a spacious living room, and a small garden where I planned to create a little green space to relax in the afternoons. The feeling of stepping through the front door, knowing that this was my place, was incredible. After all the hard work, I had finally rewarded myself with a space where I could live freely, without having to face anyone who made me feel like I didn't belong. But the joy was short-lived. A day after I finished unpacking and settling into my new home, I received a call from my mom. "Evelyn, I want to come visit you. Robert and I will stop by today." I froze when I heard those words. My mom always had this habit, but this time something felt different. I had made it clear to her that I wanted my own space, that I was building a life without interference from anyone. Yet, she still wanted to come over. And this time, she was bringing Robert and Sarah. I didn't know how to react. I had been trying to keep my distance, but this intrusion made me uncomfortable. I decided not to respond right away and simply said, "Mom, I'd love for you to visit, but just you, okay?" Unfortunately, she didn't respect that. Just as I had feared, when they arrived, it wasn't just my mom. Robert and Sarah were there too. My heart tightened as I saw them standing outside my door. I didn't say anything, but inside, I felt like my space had been invaded all over again. I didn't want to cause a scene, but I couldn't ignore the overwhelming disappointment. Even though my mom hadn't asked for permission to bring them, I reluctantly let them in. The house I had worked so hard to build was now occupied by people who weren't welcome. They walked around, making comments about the house. Not big enough. Not nice enough. Every word they said made it harder for me to breathe. This went on until they finally left, and I could once again enjoy the quiet of my own space. At least for a little while. But the real problem began when I had to go on a business trip for a few weeks. I had planned this trip for a long time, and my job required me to be away. Before leaving, I gave my mom a spare key so she could water my plants and make sure the house wasn't left unattended. But when I returned, I couldn't believe what I saw. The moment I arrived, I knew something was wrong. The front door wouldn't open like it normally did. And something felt different about the space. When I tried using my key, I couldn't get in. A wave of panic and confusion washed over me. As I stood outside, anger and frustration flooded through me. Sarah, Robert's daughter, had changed the locks and moved into my house without my permission. A feeling I couldn't describe surged inside me. I couldn't believe they had done this without my consent. This house was mine, yet they had taken it upon themselves to change everything. Everything I had built now felt brutally violated. I couldn't let this continue. Unable to endure it any longer, I decided to call the police. Standing outside my own door, my hands trembled as I dialed the emergency number. "I need help. Someone has unlawfully entered my home and changed the locks." I didn't allow myself to hesitate. This was my house, and I had every right to protect it. When the police arrived, it felt like everything around me was spinning. I stood outside, watching as they knocked on the door and demanded that Sarah open it. She looked surprised to see them, yet she still tried to remain calm, showing no sign of concern. After the officers explained the legal implications of changing the locks and trespassing on property without the owner's permission, I knew I had done the right thing. They instructed Sarah to open the door for inspection, and eventually she had no choice but to comply. The police ordered Sarah to leave the house immediately. I could see the anger on her face, but I no longer cared. I wanted this to end today. I couldn't allow them to keep treating my home as theirs, couldn't let my mother and Robert continue invading my life. The feeling of loss and pain rose like a tidal wave, but I refused to let it break me, ever again. Not long after, my mother and Robert called me. I didn't want to answer, but I knew they wouldn't stop. When I finally picked up, my mother spoke cautiously. "Evelyn, you have to understand. Sarah needed a place to stay, she had no other choice." Her voice was weak, as if she was pleading for my understanding and forgiveness. But I couldn't, and I didn't want to, understand. How can I understand when neither you nor Robert respect my privacy or my independence? My voice was filled with frustration. "No, Mom. What you don't understand is that they had no right to enter my home without my permission. This is my property, not theirs. I made it very clear that I didn't want them in my life anymore. Why do you keep making excuses for them?" I couldn't contain my anger any longer. Every word from my mother felt like a slap in the face. "You chose them over me, and now I have to suffer the consequences of that choice." There was silence on the other end. I could feel her disappointment through the phone. "You can't just let this go, can you?" she asked, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "I'm not holding on to anything, Mom. I've simply had enough." I exhaled sharply. "Sarah has to leave my house. You and Robert cannot be a part of my life anymore." My words were firm, a final declaration. I no longer wanted to hear any more justifications from her or Robert. They had no place in my life. I knew my mother wouldn't accept it easily, but I had no other choice. I couldn't let her indifference and her decisions continue to affect me. When the call ended, I felt a sense of liberation, as if a weight had been lifted off me. I no longer had to live under my mother's shadow. No longer had to endure the unfairness and neglect she had shown me. My life would no longer be invaded. I didn't have to keep growing up in a family where everyone's ego was too big for me to ever matter. The next day when I arrived at work, I felt lighter than I had in years. I had done the right thing. After years of pain, I had finally reclaimed myself. I didn't need their sympathy or their forgiveness because I had realized that I was the only person who truly mattered in my life. And I wouldn't let anyone take that independence away from me again. My mother continued to call me after that, but I didn't answer. Every time I saw her name on my screen, I was reminded of the moment she chose silence when I needed her the most. No, I couldn't go back. She and Robert had driven me away, and now, I wouldn't return just to suffer again. After everything, I felt as if I had escaped a prison. Though a small part of me still ached when I thought of my mother, my mind told me I had made the right decision. All I needed was freedom. Freedom from people who didn't respect my life or my boundaries. I decided to change the locks immediately. It wasn't just about protecting my home, it was about reclaiming control over my life. I refused to allow any more intrusion, even from my mother. A few days later, I hired a locksmith and replaced every lock in the house. Standing in front of my door, holding the new key in my hand, I felt an incredible sense of empowerment. Every time I turned the key and stepped inside, I felt like a part of me had been reborn. This house wasn't just a place to live, it had become a symbol of my independence and my strength. I could finally live on my own terms. Free to do whatever I wanted. No longer bound by anyone. After changing the locks and clearing away the traces of past intrusions, I decided to start over. Every chair, table, and item I chose reflected a part of who I was. I arranged everything myself, making the house feel warm and personal. Each space in my home told its own story. From the paintings I hung on the walls, to the books I cherished. Every corner was a result of my effort and determination. Meanwhile, my mother continued trying to contact me. She called, texted, and even sent letters. Each message carried guilt, late apologies. She wanted to see me, to talk, to find a way to mend our broken relationship. Every time I saw those messages, a wave of emotions washed over me. Both sorrow and exhaustion. I knew my mother was trying, but I couldn't go back to how things were. Everything that had happened was too clear. She had chosen Robert and Sarah over me, failing to protect me when I needed her the most. And now, no matter what she said, I couldn't forget the feeling of abandonment and pain. Her silence when I was mistreated, her indifference when I was wronged. Those were things I couldn't easily forgive. So, I decided not to answer my mother's calls anymore. I didn't want to reopen old wounds. My mother wasn't the only person in my life, and I had learned how to take care of myself, how to live a life free from the interference of others. Though this decision wasn't easy, it brought me peace. I no longer had to be part of a family where love and respect were not valued. As time passed, my life began to thrive. I advanced in my career, achieving milestones I had never dared to dream of before. I was entrusted with major projects, promoted, and received recognition from my boss and colleagues. My hard work had paid off, and I felt proud of myself. My home also became more complete. I took time to tend to every little detail, from planting my favorite flowers to organizing my workspace for maximum comfort. Every morning, as I sat by the window and looked outside, I felt grateful for my life. No more stress, no more worrying about calls or messages from my mother and Robert. Everything was within my control. Although I sometimes thought about my mother, I knew I had made the right choice. I didn't need to stay in a relationship where I didn't feel loved or respected. I had started over. And now, my life was truly mine, free from the interference of toxic people. Evelyn's story is a journey of reclaiming independence and self-worth after family betrayal. She learned to rise from emotional wounds, rebuild her life, and assert her right to self-determination. Despite facing disappointment from her loved ones, Evelyn realized that sometimes cutting ties with toxic people is necessary for self-preservation. Life isn't always easy, but through it, she found strength and happiness in freedom and independence. Evelyn's story likely makes you reflect on family relationships and the importance of protecting yourself. What do you think about Evelyn's decision? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to follow the channel for more compelling stories about family life.